terms of democracy, you get more votes. Basically, you can actually gather more votes to actually vote on that issue. We have, I have interviewed Riley, who is the secretary for Flux at one of my Brisbane Women in Blockchain meetups, and we had this conversation that it's going to take about 10 years or more before we as a society are going to be able to deal with this concept called liquid democracy, for the various reasons that Jonathan is speaking about, because it's actually a shift in the way we think. It's a shift in culture, it's a shift in values. So I guess Flux, by being around for the last, I think, 3 years, they're having that conversation. It's a very tough conversation to be had, but it's given us an option to start looking at the ways that we want to participate in our democracy, and it's there now for you to participate. You can actually go online, become a member, and start becoming activated, and vote for them at the next federal election, because they will be on the Senate.
To follow on from that and to answer your question, yes, there's definitely a role, but I mean, what was embodied there in your answer is that certain people are going to have the time to engage and will accrue more power as a process, and as a result of that process. And in our current system, we don't have equitable distribution of free time. And so, like I said, that example of having a say in your local park upgrades, I sent out a letter to every resident in my electorate. We promoted it online through social media, sent out like 10,000 emails, etc., etc. Out of the 50,000 residents in my electorate, all up, only about 500 actively voted. And most of them were voting in their own self-interest, so it was more like, I'm voting for what I think, rather than taking the time to talk to all my neighbours. So, yeah, well, maybe not, but I push back against that, but I can expand on that a little. But I guess the point is there that simply saying, oh, here's a tool, everyone has time to engage with it, when actually everyone doesn't have time, or doesn't have the resources or the confidence, isn't genuinely transformative. And I don't think there is anything radical about Flux. Like, I think it's cool and it's great that it's out there, but it is not a radical or transformative project. It's still reinforcing hierarchical power systems. It's great because it's giving people another avenue to power, but it's not necessarily tearing down the systems that fundamentally oppress people. And I think that's, for me, like, this idea that we can trade votes in a marketplace and that someone might be able to buy more votes potentially down the track, like, I think that's concerning. Again, it's the subject of a much longer conversation. Marcus, you look like you want to weigh in.
I do feel compelled to weigh in on one point, which is the kinds of experts. So I suppose working in a university environment, we are often seen as the experts. In fact, a lot of the journalists can access the experts guide to try and find me on the kind of topics that I can speak about. So in a way, I'm trying to just put a good word in for the experts. If we actually were listening to the experts, we already know what to do on so many different issues, like from what to do in general, like maybe not on the level of detail all the way to the fine granularity of the local park, but say on big issues around climate change, on renewable energy, on transport and mobility, on planning, and the list goes on. There's a whole bunch of big topics that a lot of the experts actually agree upon. And it's then very tricky when people that are voting, and they have not just the right, but also that responsibility to make up their mind, that they don't trust what University of Melbourne or University of Queensland or MIT are saying, but they trust what the Courier Mail is saying. That is a huge problem in the Australian society and here in Brisbane. We know how bad problem gambling is, but we're building a casino. We know how bad it is to have traffic congestion, yet we build laneway extensions without any consideration of active transport. In fact, Brisbane City Council apparently is using the argument of direct democracy through community engagement and saying that Wynnum Road residents and adjacent neighbours hate cyclists, and we asked them, we want these pesky cyclists to disappear, so they're not building any cycling lanes because they asked people and they didn't want any. So how do you argue with that? Right? So if people are arguing on the basis that it's not any version or form of blockchain or distributed ledgers that will rectify such issues. So I think there is a bit of a kind of Goldilocks between the pedestrian view and the helicopter view, and we also must not forget that government actually has responsibility. They have responsibility of demonstrating leadership, and that level of leadership cannot easily be delegated to a network of statistics view of averages of the pedestrian kind of opinion. There also needs to be consideration of minorities, of diversity, of the kinds of otherness of opinions for the common good, because it's not necessarily inscribed in the kinds of majorities that a lot of the current system is I suppose, putting into the blueprint of the way that Australia is governed at all three levels.
I'll just add really quickly that the problem there is, like, totally on board with giving experts more of a say. The problem, or the distinction that needs to be made, is between shallow participation and meaningful deliberation. And so the processes that we set up and the values that underline those processes and digital tools need to encourage people to not only talk to government, but to talk to each other and to be informed when they're making those decisions. Because if you set up a process that sits people down, talks them through traffic planning in detail, eventually residents will come to the view that, oh, of course we need to spend more money on public transport, of course we should build bike lanes, etc., etc. But if you have a shallow form of direct democracy, people just vote like sheep and they do listen to the Courier Mail. But the point you touched on is fundamentally that politicians, they know what the experts are saying, but they also know what their corporate donors are saying. And that's why we need to recognise that capitalism will corrupt whatever system we set up unless we insulate against it properly.
Okay, I want to move into the cryptocurrency sphere for now. So Bitcoin exists on a public chain where users' digital identity and relative transaction amounts are made visible to other participants on the network. This is in an anonymized way, just to note. So tech communities are growing more concerned around data matching techniques that are being applied to de-anonymize the Bitcoin public chain. And recently it was released in the US Patent Office that Amazon had filed a patent in 2014 to de-anonymize Bitcoin addresses and sell the data to the US government. So it appears that de-anonymization of cryptocurrency blockchains is on the rise. And I just want to pass it to Marcus first in terms of what you think the implications of this will be.
It's quite a loaded, well, the question is great, it's a loaded answer, I suppose, because if I go back to my earlier example of the Silk Road, a whole bunch of young kids found a very sneaky way of setting up a market ecosystem of purchasing drugs. If we were to find a way to undo the anonymous kinds of tradings and actually identify all these kinds of different actors in that market system, well, there's probably a whole bunch of people in Australian society that are trying to criminalise the way that drug use occurs, that are saying, well, this is great, we can finally put them into jail. And perhaps in extreme cases where it's not about the actual consumption, but about making the profit and exploiting vulnerable people, that could be the right answer. But in so many other cases where it's, your sons and daughters, or my sons and daughters, it may not be the right solution. It might be more of a way of looking at this from a health perspective than a criminal perspective. So that's already kind of an interesting, I suppose, scenario if you start to de-anonymize transactions on the Bitcoin currency ledger, because the original transactions were done under the disguise of anonymity, and so the implications of undoing this are quite profound. And it may not be for every single one. There might be all sorts of very trivial, banal kind of transactions where the parties involved, they don't necessarily care. So it's something that may be more interesting to consider for future blockchain implementations or future cryptocurrency implementations. So if I bring in the example of Beef Ledger, Katrina already mentioned these issues around food provenance and being able as a consumer of food items to know where your food comes from. The other big dimension that we are focusing on in that implementation is around smart contracts. So if we have a beef producer over there, and the commodity kind of travels through the supply chain, and there is a whole bunch of different stakeholders all the way to a consumer over in China that wants to purchase and eat Wagyu beef from Australia, then each transaction is exposed to a whole bunch of different negotiations, to currency fluctuations, to market fluctuations, as well as the power of negotiation. And so what we are noticing is, especially with smaller beef producers, they don't necessarily have the agency or the legal representation or the way of weighing into those negotiations. So they have to trust big brands that are aggregating different feedlots and different cattle and produce along the supply chain. So what smart contracts are able to do is allow even smaller producers of, in this case, beef, to have a say by dictating certain conditions into these different negotiations at each point of transaction. So that actually allows smaller producers to have like if you kind of think of it as an extended arm, all the way along the supply chain. So coming back to the question of anonymity, that's a good thing to then know, well, where does the profit go, rather than it just disappearing with a whole bunch of middlemen, whether in the Australian domestic market that is Coles and Woolies, or whether this is other members of Meat and Livestock Australia. This is actually a huge need that beef producers are demanding. It's a very sore point with regards to their current existence as commercial players, and it's actually the way that we can pinpoint and identify these transactions. This is now a different, technically speaking, a different blockchain implementation called Ethereum that enables us to use smart contracts. So this wouldn't be possible on the Bitcoin ledger. But I think that might be quite a nice comparison, kind of look at the benefits of anonymized trading on the Bitcoin cryptocurrency ledger, as well as the pinpointed, identified kinds of transactions that we are trying to implement on the beef ledger that runs on Ethereum.
I'm just trying to think. I'm thinking, how the hell do you de-anonymise a Bitcoin unless you're going to convince the coders to code it?
De-anonymise it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of... But I mean, I guess this is a conversation that we have all the time. It's like, so we turn around and go like, oh, what are the implications if the blockchain is de-anonymised and that sort of stuff? And I'm like, for Christ's sake, people, our existing world is this way. Every time that you enter something, your data is collected. You are identified. Why are we looking at this technology and saying, oh my God, what if this happens? What if this happens? Look around now at how we're existing right now with our web experience. It's pretty shit. And Amazon are already doing it. So I don't give a shit if they've got a patent for this stuff. I don't care, they're already doing it. It's you choices as you as consumers about who you choose to interact with. And don't put it on the technology community to solve these problems. It comes down to governance, yes it does. It comes down to the regulatory environment. It comes down to policy. It comes down to consumers. It comes about where you choose to engage your transactions. So I guess we're so at the early stage of this technology. Think about the internet in 1993, when everyone was sitting around trying to work out what's the internet, how does email work. We're at exactly the same conversation. So you've got 22,000 developers within the Ethereum network that are really working hard to build out the network. Just the network, that's where we're at, people. We don't have all the beautiful applications across this technology yet. That's what our company is working on. We work on protocols so these applications can be built. But we're so much at the early stages. So to have a conversation, which is an important conversation to have, is too early. Yes, you do have your private blockchains and they are being created by the banks, but it's to actually create clearance and settlement from a T3 down to a T1 or whatever they want to do. But yeah, those nodes are their own, they set their own regulatory, their own governance. We work on the public blockchains because we like the protocol that's been created, we like the smart contract technology, but again, it depends on the problem you're solving and how you build the design to actually transact that information or transact that data. But I get cranky, I'm quite immersed in this technology, and I find it interesting when we exist in this world that is pretty crap, and then now everyone's starting to wake up to this tech, which has been around on the 31st of October, it'll be around for 10 years. And now people are saying, well, blockchain, will it do this? And what happens if it does that? And it's like, but it's already happening, you know. Every day data is getting hacked, data is getting stolen, cybersecurity, denial of service, it's happening now. So blockchain technology is not the panacea here, it's governance. It's the way we actually organise ourselves, the way we look at data, the way we have a relationship with this data.
I just want to just ask in light of that though, do we think that Bitcoin will lose some of its appeal if mass de-anonymisation happens?
If we lose trust because of this situation, you can kiss this entire technology goodbye. It's gone.
I mean, just specifically the Bitcoin implementation though. I mean, with privacy coins and such, will we see those become more of reserve currencies?
Well, I guess it depends. Ecosystem. Yeah, I guess it depends on how the devs, the community will actually respond to this and what they do. But I don't know. I'm just sort of sitting here going. Maybe I've got some of my friends here from our community, Peter and Joe and Tracy and Kai. We're all very immersed in this community. They're just up there looking at me. I've got my daughter here. But, I mean, do you guys have I guess we can talk about this through the Q&A down the track. But I would really like to hear your conversations, particularly you, Peter, and Joe, because of what you're doing internationally with ICOs, around this whole concept of de-anonymisation of Bitcoin.
I might, just to pick up on that initial conversation, what shits me really is when developers and tech innovators, etc., try and occupy this state of ethical ambiguity or neutrality. I'm not saying that's what you're doing at all, but like...
No, you just don't say that to a coder.
No, but every coder has an ethical responsibility to consider the implications of the tools they are creating. And maybe that's a fundamental values disagreement, but...
No?
Well, I'll finish what I'm saying and then we can... But like, we have to be conscious continually of the flow-on impacts and implications of the tech we're trying to introduce and the changes we're trying to create in the world. That's not a reason to resist change or say, no change, we just keep everything as it is. But it is so, I think, morally bankrupt to say, oh, I just build it, someone else can deal with the impacts down the line. Like, I mean, we know that like Bitcoin does have some pretty negative impacts in terms of like the power usage to like verify transactions, etc. That's not a fundamental problem with blockchain technology. That's just Bitcoin was early technology; it had its issues. But like, there's a bunch of issues in every form of new technology that gets introduced, and the people who are at the forefront and pushing that change, particularly if you're saying this is the future, this